Hello and welcome to the peripheral nervous system. Here we'll be looking at the cranial nerves, the spinal nerves, and we'll consider a few spinal reflex pathways. So recall that nerves are bundles of axons in the peripheral nervous system. However, these axons either have their axon terminals within the central nervous system if they are sensory neurons taking information into the CNS, or if they are motor neurons, their cell bodies originate in the central nervous system and their axons exit the CNS and become part of the nerves. From the brain, we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. They are numbered with Roman numerals, which you need to know, and they each have individual names. So you are responsible to match the Roman numeral name and the name, if you will. Now, some cranial nerves carry only sensory neurons, so those are considered sensory cranial nerves. Others contain only motor neurons, and others are mixed, meaning that they contain both sensory and motor fibers. Most of this is self-study, so I'm going to go over it quickly. The notes are quite clear. I've also provided a summary table under weekly learning assignments. Please refer to it. This is the inferior view of the brain and the brainstem in particular, which shows you the origin for the 12 cranial nerves. They are listed on the right. The first letter of the name of each cranial nerve can be used to create a memory aid to help you learn and remember the cranial nerves in order. So this is my little ditty. O, 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 to touch and feel. Very good vacuum, a Hoover. So that little rhyme is made up of the first letters of each of the cranial nerves in order from 1 to 12. You can come up with your own or check the internet for others. You might find one that you prefer better. Let's go through them quickly. This is just an anterior view showing you the origin of a few of the cranial nerves. We have 2 associated with the cerebrum, that's 1 and 2. 3 and 4 associated with the midbrain. 5 through 8 are associated with the pons, and part of 8 through 12 are associated with the medulla. Number 1 is the olfactory nerve. It is purely sensory for smell and projects just beneath the cerebrum where the fibers converge in a structure called the olfactory bulb. Number 2 is the optic nerve. It is also purely sensory. It originates with cells in the retina called ganglion cells, which carry information from photoreceptors in the eye into the brain along this optic nerve. So it is the nerve of vision. The pathway for vision ends in the primary visual cortex of the occipital lobes in the cerebrum. We'll look at that pathway later. The third cranial nerve is the oculomotor, which is the third O of the OOO. It is purely motor, so the olfactory number 1 and optic number 2 were purely sensory. The oculomotor is purely motor, so it's carrying signals out of the brain to various structures. Specifically, the somatic motor branches supply 4 of the 6 skeletal muscles that control eye movement. So they're called the extrinsic eye muscles because they're outside of the eyeball, but attached to it and help to move the eye. The autonomic motor fibers are part of the parasympathetic nervous system division. So they are PSNS autonomic motor, and they innervate one set of the intrinsic eye muscles, and these are the ones that constrict the pupil to reduce the amount of light entering the eye. Please note that the oculomotor nerve is associated with or send signals from the midbrain. Cranial nerve 4 is the trochlear. It is also purely motor, as is the oculomotor, but it is purely somatic motor. It is the smallest of the cranial nerves. It also originates in the midbrain, and it innervates another set of extrinsic eye muscles that move the eyeball. So far the oculomotor and trochlear are 2 of the 3 cranial nerves that move the eyes. Number 5 is the trigeminal nerve. It is the largest of the cranial nerves. Its origins are in the pons, and it is mixed. So it has both motor and sensory axons. There are 3 branches: the ophthalmic, the maxillary, and the mandibular. Its sensory function receives information about touch, pain, and pressure, as well as temperature, coming from the skin of the face. So it's sensory for the skin of the face, as well as the nasal cavity, the pharynx or the throat, the tongue, and the mouth. So any sensory information coming from your head essentially travels into the brain along the trigeminal nerve. The motor axons send signals to or innervate the muscles of mastication, the main one being the masseter muscle in the cheek or buccal area. So the trigeminal nerve plays a large role in chewing. Number 6 is the abducens nerve. It is related to the oculomotor and trochlear in that it is purely motor, and it innervates another set of extrinsic eye muscles that move or abduct the eyeball, rotating it laterally on either side. So your 3 eye movers are the oculomotor number 3, the trochlear number 4, and the abducens nerve. Also note that the abducens is one of the nerves that originates from the pons. Moving on to number 7, which is the facial nerve. The facial nerve should not be confused with the trigeminal. The facial nerve is also mixed. Its sensory portion extends from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue and is sensory for taste. Its motor aspects, however, are to the muscles of the face for facial expression. It also has autonomic motor fibers, which are part of the PSNS division, that stimulate production and flow of saliva. So it's motor for salivation, and it's motor to the lacrimal glands in the eye sockets for producing tears or lacrimation. So even though it's called a facial nerve, it is motor facial, while the trigeminal nerve is sensory facial, if that makes sense. The vestibulocochlear nerve is number 8. Now this nerve is also large. Part of it originates in the pons and the other part in the medulla. It is purely sensory, but it is sensory for 2 types of sensations. It is associated with receptors in your inner ear. Those along the vestibular branch carry impulses from the ear into the brain for equilibrium. Vestibular goes with equilibrium, while the cochlear branch is associated with receptors in the cochlear structure of the ear and is sensory for hearing. So these signals will eventually project to the auditory cortex in the thalamus. Cranial nerve 9 is the glossopharyngeal nerve, and even though we're referring to only one nerve, please recall that they occur in pairs on either side of the brain. Cranial nerve 9 is a mixed cranial nerve. It is sensory for taste buds in the posterior third of the tongue, so it is sensory for taste, as is the facial nerve. They both work together with respect to that function. It is also sensory for receptors located in the carotid artery of the neck. These include baroreceptors for blood pressure and chemoreceptors for blood chemistry, such as oxygen levels, pH, etc. Those are very important autonomic sensory functions. The glossopharyngeal nerve is also motor. It contains autonomic motor fibers that extend to the salivary glands to stimulate the release of saliva or salivation. That was another common function with the facial nerve. And it contains somatic motor neurons that signal the muscles of the larynx and pharynx for swallowing. Moving on to cranial nerve 10, which is the vagus nerve. Please note the proper spelling of this vagus. This is not like Vegas out in Nevada in the States. This is cranial nerve 10, VAGUS. Now this is another large and very important cranial nerve. It is also mixed and originates from the medulla. It has axons that receive signals from and extend to a large region of the body, all the way down to the thorax and abdomen. Let's look at the sensory branches. The sensory fibers deal with a variety of sensations. So similar to the glossopharyngeal nerve, the vagus nerve also receives signals from baroreceptors and chemoreceptors, but these are located in the aorta, which is the major artery branching off the heart. So this would be within the thoracic region. Its somatic sensory function is from the muscles of the neck and the throat. And autonomic sensory also includes receptors in most of the thoracic and abdominal viscera. So even though we are not consciously aware or able to localize very well sensations coming from our internal organs, they do have receptors that send signals into the brain, most of them along the vagus nerve. The motor aspects of the vagus nerve again arise from the medulla and supply the skeletal muscles of the pharynx, larynx, and soft palate, that's the roof of your mouth, that are involved in swallowing, similar to the glossopharyngeal, but also for vocalization. That is the ability to form distinguishable sounds like I am doing right now to provide this lecture. Most importantly, if I may say so, is the autonomic motor function arising from the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is responsible for about 80% of all of the PSNS or parasympathetic nervous system output in the central nervous system. The PSNS branches of the vagus nerve extend to the heart to slow its rate of contraction, extend to glands of the gastrointestinal tract or your digestive tract, and the smooth muscle of the respiratory passageways and digestive organs. So this cranial nerve is a major PSNS nerve. So in this diagram, we can see the origins of the vagus nerve in the medulla and how it has several branches that extend from the face all the way down to the digestive tract. That's a very important nerve. And again, most of its output is PSNS or autonomic motor, or a better way to say that is most of the PSNS motor output is along the vagus nerve. The second last nerve is the accessory nerve, number 11. This is an interesting nerve. It is purely motor. It has origins in the medulla as well as contributing fibers from spinal nerves C1 through C5. So as it leaves the central nervous system, the fibers sort into the cranial accessory nerve and the spinal accessory nerve branches. To summarize, its main function is to provide fibers to the sternocleidomastoid and trapezius muscles that move the head. So damage to the accessory nerve will result in the inability to raise or rotate the head. And finally, the hypoglossal nerve, cranial nerve 12, which also is purely motor, originating from the medulla, sends nerve signals to the tongue for speech or articulation, as did the vagus, as well as to the mouth for swallowing. So purely motor, somatic motor for speech and swallowing. And that ends the cranial nerves. Let's move on to the spinal nerves. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, but they are easy to name because they are named for the level of the spinal cord at which they exit through the intervertebral foramen between the vertebrae. All spinal nerves are mixed, meaning that they have both motor and sensory axons. And even though there are 7 cervical vertebrae, the first cervical nerve, C1, branches above the C1 vertebra and the last one below the C7 vertebra, giving you a total of 8 cervical spinal nerves. The remaining nerves branch below the corresponding vertebra, so there are 12 thoracic cervical nerves, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, which exit between the foramen within the sacrum, and 1 coccygeal nerve, denoted C01 or C01. The spinal nerves are bundled together very similarly to the arrangement of fibers within a skeletal muscle. So there are 3 connective tissue layers within spinal nerves. They are the epineurium that covers the entire nerve, the perineurium, which bundles fascicles of axons within the nerve, and each axon is covered with its own endoneurium. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? So again, spinal nerves connect the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system. Nerves are bundles of axons in the PNS, but they are associated with sensory receptors that are sending signals into the CNS, as well as motor neurons that originate in the CNS and send signals along their axons to muscles and glands in the peripheral nervous system. The pairs of spinal nerves, are named according to the level of the vertebral column from which they exit. So we noted that there are 8 cervical spinal nerves, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. Within the nerve, the axons are surrounded by their own connective tissue layer called the endoneurium, and it surrounds both myelinated and unmyelinated axons. Those axons with their endoneurium are then bundled together into fascicles. Each fascicle is surrounded by its own connective tissue layer called the perineurium. And then the fascicles are bundled together with blood vessels that supply the nerves and lymphatics to form the entire nerve, which is surrounded by the epineurium. So here's a diagram showing the arrangement of the axon fibers. It looks very similar to something we've seen before. Oh, I remember, a skeletal muscle. So a very similar arrangement with the connective tissue layers and the bundling. Please refer back to our discussion on the spinal cord, where we looked at how the axons on the posterior aspect of the spinal cord are bundled together into dorsal roots. And anteriorly, your motor axons are bundled into ventral or anterior roots, and they converge very close to the spinal cord to form these 31 pairs of spinal nerves, which again is now going to be mixed because it contains sensory fibers from the dorsal or posterior roots, as well as motor axons from the anterior roots. In the diagram, which is a superior view looking down at the spinal cord and these associated structures in the PNS, you'll note that axons in the spinal nerves then branch again into two bundles called rami or rami. Pick your choice. The anterior or ventral rami contain both sensory and motor neurons, as do the dorsal rami, and the anterior rami from each spinal nerve are going to converge with axons from rami of other spinal cord nerves or spinal nerves at different levels to form structures called plexuses. So to reiterate, the axons in the dorsal roots at each spinal cord level, which are sensory, converge with the axons in the ventral root, which are purely motor, to form your mixed spinal nerves at each spinal cord level. The nerves exit the vertebral column through the intervertebral or intervertebral foramen, which are the spaces between the vertebral bones, and then the axons soon split or divide into two new bundles called rami. So one is called a dorsal ramus, whose axons will extend to the posterior aspects of the body, and the other are called ventral rami. Now the ventral rami from several spinal cord levels, with the exception of those at the thoracic level, will converge and mix extensively in structures called plexuses. So a plexus is a network, and it allows nerve fibers from different spinal cord levels or different spinal nerves to sort and then supply a particular region of the body. This means that any given region of the skin or skeletal muscle in an area is actually innervated by axons from several spinal cord levels, never just one. So coming out of the plexuses are specific nerves that supply a particular region of the body, and those nerves are mixed, containing sensory and motor fibers. The two superior plexuses are the cervical and brachial plexuses. These are produced from axons in the cervical region of the spinal cord. And then there is the lumbar plexus from the lumbar spinal nerves, and the sacral plexus, which receives fibers from the lower lumbar region and the sacral region. Technically, there is a small fifth plexus called the coccygeal plexus, which we probably will not discuss because it's very small and innervates a small posterior region in the lower body. Now, the thoracic region does not produce a plexus. Its ventral rami travel to the areas of the thoracic region directly at the level at which they exit the spinal cord. So the thoracic area maps pretty cleanly to the level of the spinal cord in that region. The first plexus is the cervical plexus. It is located deep in the neck, again pretty close to the spinal cord, and is formed by axons in ventral rami from spinal nerves C1 through C5. The specific nerves that come out of this plexus innervate the neck, shoulder, and chest, upper chest regions, and also send signals to the trapezius and sternocleidomastoid muscles of the neck. Those are the main muscles supplied by nerves from this plexus. Also coming out of this plexus is the phrenic nerve, P-H-R-E-N-I-C, and this nerve is so significant because it extends to the diaphragm skeletal muscle and is the nerve that signals the diaphragm for breathing. It originates from spinal levels C3 and C4, or spinal nerves C3 and C4. So a spinal cord injury above C3 will result in no signals to the diaphragm, and that person will not be able to breathe on their own without a ventilator. Damage within C3 or the C4 level of the spinal cord will interfere with normal diaphragmatic breathing, and injury below C4 will allow the diaphragm to be signaled by the phrenic nerve, but that individual will have trouble breathing deeply or controlling breathing with respect to the accessory muscles that help to clear secretions during coughing, etc. We'll talk more about that in semester 4 when we do look at spinal cord injuries, but it's important to understand this normal anatomy at this level so that you can interpret and understand the loss of function that occurs with spinal cord injuries at various levels. The next plexus is the brachial plexus, which lies deep to the clavicle. It is also formed by axons from the cervical spinal nerves. Here they are contributing fibers from spinal cord levels C5 through C8 as well as T1. The nerves coming out of this plexus generally supply the shoulders, the upper limbs, as well as the anterior chest or the thoracic region. Important nerves that arise out of the brachial plexus are the axillary nerve that signals the deltoid and the skin around the shoulder region. We also have the musculocutaneous nerve that innervates the biceps brachial muscle, the pectoral nerves that innervate the pectoralis major muscles, and the radial nerve that innervates the triceps brachii muscle. So what I've done is I've highlighted specific nerves that innervate and signal muscles that we learned back in the muscular anatomy unit. The median and ulnar nerve innervate the muscles of the forearm and hands for fine motor control. So this means that damage within this level of the spinal cord or this plexus will affect the ability to control the muscles of the upper limbs. Again, there is no plexus in the thoracic area. The next plexus is the lumbar plexus, which is formed by axons in the anterior rami of spinal nerves L1 through L4. The nerves coming out of this plexus supply the anterior and lateral abdominal wall, the external genitals, and mainly the anterior parts of the lower limbs. Major nerves coming out of this plexus include the femoral nerve, which innervates the quadriceps femoris group, as well as the obturator nerves. The last major plexus we will consider is the sacral plexus. It is formed by axons from levels L4 and L5 and S1 through S4. So it's quite a few spinal cord levels contributing to this plexus. Now, while the nerves coming out of the lumbar plexus supply the anterior lower limb, the nerves coming out of the sacral plexus mainly supply the posterior lower limb as well as the buttocks and perineum. So these include the gluteal nerves that innervate the gluteus muscles. The sciatic nerve, which is the largest nerve in the body, branches into several nerves, including the common fibular and its branches. The fibular nerve, or common fibular nerves branches, innervate the tibialis anterior muscle, interestingly, while the tibial nerve innervates the hamstrings and the gastrocnemius. So the names don't quite match because the tibialis anterior muscle is anterior, but it is innervated by the fibular nerve, and vice versa for the posterior muscles of the lower limb. So here's a diagram showing you which areas of the body are supplied by the fibers coming from the sacral plexus and lumbar one. So lumbar for the more anterior parts of the lower limb, and the sacral plexus for the posterior parts of the lower limb. So the small coccygeal plexus is formed by the anterior rami of S4, S5, and the coccygeal nerve. It supplies a small area of skin in the coccygeal region, but also contains motor fibers. A good way to visualize the contributions of various spinal cord levels to the nerves that innervate various parts of the body is to look at a dermatome map, as seen in this slide. A dermatome is an area of skin that provides sensory input to the central nervous system via one pair of spinal nerves, or in the case of the head, the trigeminal nerve. So if you look at the map, you'll see that the areas of skin correlate with the spinal cord levels from the plexuses or thoracic region that we described previously. So for example, the cervical plexus, which had contributing fibers from C1 through C5, innervates the skin of the posterior head, neck, and upper chest and shoulders, while fibers in the brachial plexus supplied the shoulders as well, the anterior chest, the pectoral muscles, and most of the upper limbs. The thoracic spinal nerves have fibers that directly innervate the thoracic region at the level at which they exit the spinal cord, shown in blue, while the lumbar plexus fibers, L1 through L4, 5, supply the anterior lower limb, while the sacral plexus nerves supplied the buttocks and the perineum and the posterior lower limb. Dermatomes are also important for assessing spinal cord injuries. The area of skin innervated by a particular spinal nerve will not be able to transmit signals above the level of injury. So a client can be asked, can you feel this? Can you feel this? Can you feel this? As the nurse applies pressure to various parts of the skin, and wherever the sensations cannot be detected, one can hypothesize that the spinal cord injury is above the level of the spinal cord that correlates with that area of skin. Let's move on to consider some integrative pathways now, looking at sensory and motor tracts. We did look at these when we were introduced to them in the spinal cord. Again, the name of a tract often indicates its location in the white matter and where it begins and ends. So the tracts we will look at are the sensory spinothalamic tract, which is sensory for pain, temperature, as well as itching, and the posterior column tracts, which are sensitive for touch, pressure, vibration, and proprioception. Proprioception, again, are sensations from skeletal muscles and joints, or somatic sensations. Motor tracts are those that control the skeletal muscles. Some are direct, which provide conscious voluntary control of the skeletal muscles. The corticospinal tracts can be located in the lateral spinal cord as well as the anterior spinal cord, and these provide conscious voluntary control of the muscles of the limbs and the trunk. The corticobulbar motor tract similarly provides voluntary control of skeletal muscles, but these are the ones in the face and neck. We also have indirect motor tracts, which provide automatic or subconscious control of skeletal muscle activity related to things that we are not aware of but require skeletal muscle tone. So these include posture and balance and just stimulation of the muscles to keep them firm and prevent degeneration. So that's muscle tone. I will not pronounce all of these, but we have the rubrospinal tract, the tectospinal tract, vestibulospinal, you know that one's involved with balance, and the reticulospinal tract. So I guess I did pronounce them all. You do not need to know these. The main ones are the corticospinal tracts, which we will consider in more detail in a few slides. Before we get to those larger motor tracts, we are first going to consider reflex pathways. Reflexes are automatic, very sudden and short pathways that provide involuntary responses to stimuli. There are both somatic and autonomic reflexes. Please do not confuse autonomic with automatic. So automatic means it is a predictable, predetermined response to a stimulus, and you have those for autonomic stimuli from the viscera, as well as somatic pathways from the and to the skeletal muscles and joints. Many reflexes are integrated right in the spinal cord, and all reflex pathways or arcs involve the following 5 components. They begin with a sensory receptor that detects the stimulus in the periphery, which then sends signals along sensory neurons into the CNS, where integration occurs. This results in signals leaving the central nervous system along motor neurons to a target or effector in the peripheral nervous system, which will generate a response. So as this diagram shows you, reflex arcs begin with sensory receptors in the periphery that generate a receptor potential that travels along a sensory neuron, depending on the type of sensation. It could be somatic or autonomic sensory, that will enter the spinal cord. Remember that the cell bodies of all sensory neurons are located in ganglia in the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system, in this case the spinal cord, acts as the integration center. The reflex arc may or may not involve interneurons for integration, but the sensory component is somehow integrated to motor output that then is sent along motor neurons that exit the spinal cord, in this case through the ventral roots, and direct the signal to targets or effectors in the peripheral nervous system, such as a muscle or a gland. So we are going to consider 2 somatic reflex arcs that integrate right in the spinal cord. The 2 reflex pathways we will consider are the stretch reflex, also known as the knee jerk reflex. This one is a response to stretching of the quadriceps femoris muscle in the thigh when the knee is flexed and that muscle is stretched. It is protective and prevents overstretching of the muscle. Another protective reflex is the flexor or withdrawal reflex. It causes removal or withdrawal of a part of the body in response to a painful stimulus. For each of these pathways, please consider the following. the type of receptor that is activated and where in the body, the components of integration in the spinal cord. So how many synapses? Is it monosynaptic or polysynaptic? That will determine, or sorry, that is determined by how many interneurons are involved in that pathway. Consider if the integration occurs at one spinal cord level or at several spinal cord levels, where that pathway would then be considered intersegmental. Also consider whether the signal enters and exits on the same side, which will make it ipsilateral, or if the signal enters and exits on the opposite side of the spinal cord, which will make it contralateral. Finally, consider the effectors for each pathway and the response in the effector. So the first pathway we will consider is a stretch reflex. It results in contraction of the skeletal muscles in response to stretching of the muscle. So this pathway is monosynaptic in the spinal cord. The sensory neuron synapses directly with the motor neuron to generate the output. It is ipsilateral. The signal enters and exits on the same side. And it results in contraction of the quadriceps femoris muscle, causing knee extension as a response. The type of receptor that's activated is a proprioceptor in the quadriceps muscle. So let's do this pathway in order. When the knee is flexed, the quadriceps femoris muscle is stretched. Hitting the patellar ligament, by which the quad muscle group attaches to the tibia bone, causes further stretching of the quadriceps group. That stretching of the muscle is detected by proprioceptors in the muscle, specifically called spindle receptors. It sends signals along sensory neurons into the spinal cord, where the sensory neuron synapses directly with a motor neuron in the anterior horn. And then that motor neuron sends a signal out to the quadriceps muscle group itself, causing contraction of the quads, leading to knee extension. And in this way, the stretch reflex pathway prevents overstretching of the quadriceps group by signaling its contraction and then extension of the knee. So it causes the knee to jerk out just with a simple tap below the kneecap in the patellar ligament. All right, so this diagram walks you through it as does the animation. So let's go through it quickly. There in the quadriceps femoris group, we have the proprioceptor, which detects the stretching of the muscle when the patellar ligament is tapped gently. The signal enters the spinal cord along a sensory neuron, which synapses directly with a motor neuron in the anterior horn, sending a signal to the quadriceps muscle group, causing it to contract and cause knee extension. Please note that the sensory neuron also synapses with an inhibitory interneuron that sends an inhibitory signal to the antagonist muscle, so in this case the hamstring group in the thigh, so that the antagonist relaxes while the quadriceps group, the agonist muscles, contract. The other pathway is the flexor or withdrawal pathway. This one is polysynaptic, so it involves interneurons. It is ipsilateral, so it enters and exits on the same side of the spinal cord, but it is intersegmental. So let's look at that. Stepping on a sharp object, such as a tack, is a pain stimulus detected by nociceptors. Nerve impulses are sent along sensory neurons into the spinal cord that activate interneurons at several levels of the spinal cord. So it is intersegmental. These interneurons synapse with motor neurons in the anterior horns at those several levels. sending signals out to the flexor muscles of the knee. So in this case, that would be the hamstring muscles, which cause knee flexion and withdrawal of the leg from the painful stimulus. If this was occurring in the hand, for example, the hand was placed on a sharp or hot surface, the hand would immediately withdraw as the signals are sent from the nociceptors into the spinal cord, integrating at several spinal cord levels involving several interneurons. But now the target or the effector would be the bicep brachii muscle and the brachialis muscles in the arm, which would cause flexion at the elbow and withdrawal of the hand from the painful stimulus. Please note that these reflexes integrate and are controlled within the spinal cord, but signals are also sent up via the sensory tracts to the cerebrum of the brain so that the individual is made aware of these stimuli, even though the cerebrum is not controlling these pathways. So here's the flexor reflex. Again, in this case, a stimulus was nociception created by stepping on a sharp object, sensory information sent to the spinal cord, which then synapsed with interneurons at several levels of the spinal cord, so it's intersegmental. These interneurons then synapsed with motor neurons in those several levels, which sent signals out along motor neurons to the muscles of the hamstring group, which would be the effector. Contraction of the hamstrings causes flexion at the knee, which withdraws the lower limb or the leg from the painful stimulus. So that's the flexor reflex. There are others. These are the two for which you are responsible.